Every year around this time, the world splits into two screaming camps. You know the ones. On one side, you have the fairytale, the happy, smiling pilgrims with the buckles on their hats and the smiling Indians, all at a big, joyous potluck where everybody sat around and sang Kumbaya. And then on the other side, you have the modern correction, the idea that the first Thanksgiving was a calculated and cold-blooded genocide, a terrible bloodbath where the pilgrims sat over the dead bodies of poor innocent natives, cackling like psychopaths as they sharpened their knives. It's the Twitter-fed version of history. And the uncomfortable truth is that both of them are fantasies. They are lies that we tell ourselves because the reality, the cold, hard, desperate reality of 1621 is far too complicated and simultaneously simple to fit on a bumper sticker. The first Thanksgiving wasn't a party, and it certainly wasn't a massacre. It was a desperate political deal between two groups who were standing on the very edge of extinction. So, traveler, why don't you pour yourself a drink? Settle in. Let's stop moralizing about a time we didn't have to survive in. Let's you and I take a look at what actually happened. First, let's set the stage. When the Pilgrims stepped off the Mayflower, they weren't setting foot into a pristine wilderness. They were walking out into a graveyard. Modern folk tend to forget this, whether willingly or not, but the Pilgrims did not bring the plague with them. By the time they got there, the apocalypse had already happened. Between 1616 and 1619, nameless French traders and fishermen had already visited the coast, leaving behind European diseases, probably by rats that had come off the ship. And contrary to the popular narrative, it wasn't some plague of smallpox that actually came later. Most credible scholars actually believe it was a disease called leptospirosis. And in those 4 years, between 1616 and 1620, this disease ran like a wildfire through the Wampanoag people. Some numbers say that it killed as many as 90% of their population. Entire villages were left rotting above ground because there was no one left alive to bury the dead. So when the Pilgrims came upon the site that we now call Plymouth, they weren't conquering a thriving city, they were squatting in a ghost town that used to be called Patuxet. And they were planting corn in fields that had already been cleared by dead men. And the most important thing that we have to understand about this was not a clash of titans. It was quite literally two groups of survivors, huddled together at the very edge of a map, trying to survive in a world that was desperately trying to kill them. There's this odd mythology that for some reason Europeans were immune to these diseases, but they decimated just as many, if not more, Europeans than they did the natives of the area. And now we have entering stage right the leader, Massasoit, of the Wampanoag people. He wasn't the noble savage of the fairy tale, and he wasn't some helpless victim. He would scoff at the idea of being called such. He was a shrewd and hard-nosed politician, and he had a problem. His people, the Wampanoag, were shattered. And watching them from the west were their traditional rivals, the Narragansett, who they regularly did war with. The Narragansett had more or less been untouched by the plague. They were strong, they were numerous, and they were waiting for the perfect opportunity to just wipe the Wampanoag off the map. And Massasoit looked at these Englishmen who had become pathetic with sickness. You see, the previous year, the crops had failed badly and most of them had died. They did better in 1621, but they were still hurting badly, trying to grow crops in this alien soil. They were starving, many of them were dying of scurvy, and he saw that they didn't know how to farm this land. But he also saw that they had thunder tools, muskets and cannons. He didn't see friends, he saw leverage. He saw a weapon that he could point at his rivals, the Narragansett, and save his people from annihilation. And so he made a choice. He walked into their camp, not to share turkey, but to sign a pact, an agreement, a mutual defense pact, and the deal was simple. I will feed you, and you will shoot on my behalf so that my people don't get conquered. It wasn't charity from either side. It was early stage geopolitics. So to the feast in 1621, we're gonna go ahead and kill the Norman Rockwell painting right here and now. This was not a cozy, friendly family dinner. As a matter of fact, before it even started, the Pilgrims had had a fairly successful harvest, and they were firing their guns off in the air in celebration. It's a time-honored American tradition, goes all the way back to 1621. Well, Massasoit and his fellow tribesmen, they weren't used to this sort of celebration, so they came in armed and dangerous with 90 warriors, thinking that they were being attacked. And boy, that must have been a scene. Imagine the tension. 50 very well armed but sickly Englishmen and 90 heavily armed Wampanoag soldiers, all in a field. Nobody really knows what's going on. But they celebrated for 3 days straight, probably eyeing each other suspiciously from across the table the whole time. They ate venison, not turkey, which the Wampanoag brought, by the way. They probably had fowl and a whole lot of eel, which you don't really think of that as a traditional Thanksgiving food, now do you? Eel. So no delicious pumpkin pie, no cranberry sauce, just a whole lot of meat and a whole lot of suspicion. Sounds like my Thanksgivings. But it was a diplomatic summit, and there was definitely a show of force on both sides, but it was more or less smoothed over with food. And it was a tense peace, held together by the fact that they realized they needed each other to survive the winter. Now here is where we need to have a very serious talk about how we view history. We live in an age of instant gratification, and because of that, we can scroll past 100 disasters in a minute, all on our little magic boxes, and because of that, we broadly as a people suffer from a disease called time compression. We look at 1621 and then out at all of the atrocities that happened later. You know, King Philip's War in 1675, the Trail of Tears, and we immediately think that happened the very next day. We judge Massasoit for making a deal with the white man, because we know eventually something is going to happen. But he didn't have a crystal ball, he didn't know what was going to happen, all he knew is that there was a threat next door, and the big threat was not the Pilgrims. But it's very easy for us to look back in our infinite wisdom and assume that we would have done better. And here's the crazy thing, is that deal, that cynical deal, it kept peace for 50 years. Half a century. That was unheard of in the 1600s. Nobody lasted 50 years not fighting anywhere in the world in the 1600s. 2 generations of children grew up without fear of a raid. And even in the broader history of human conflict, 50 years of peace is a bleeding miracle. The betrayal didn't happen at that table. It didn't happen the next day. It didn't happen until decades later, when a whole new generation of settlers arrived. Zealots who didn't know the Wampanoag people, who hadn't sat across the table from them, who didn't owe them their lives. They were the ones who broke the bond. But to blame the survivors of 1621 for the sins of those in 1675 is a profound act of intellectual laziness. It is quite easy, though, isn't it, to sit in a warm room with a full belly and judge the actions of starving men. Makes us feel morally superior, doesn't it? Which is a bit rich, considering most of us can't even make it through a Thanksgiving dinner without fighting about politics or football. So if we can't manage peace with full stomachs, warm rooms, and football on the television, who are we to judge men who managed peace with muskets and starvation? The first Thanksgiving was not a fairy tale, but it also wasn't a crime scene. As a matter of fact, it was a moment of grace amidst the horror of living in 1620. It was 2 groups of people from entirely different worlds who looked at each other and decided, for today at least, we will not kill one another. We will eat. So when you sit down to your feast this week, or whatever year you might be seeing or coming upon this story, don't toast to the fantasy. Don't toast to the fiction. Toast to the real story. Toast to the hard, ugly, desperate work of making peace in a violent world. And remember that sometimes the enemy of your enemy is the only reason you're still breathing. At least that was true for our ancestors. Stay bloodthirsty, my friends. We'll see you next time. Sanchez.